Welcome to Innovation and Leadership. Today on the show, we've got Kyle Mills.
Fade started with that idea of this guy that was colorful and funny, but also very nonchalant about killing people. And so when I started that book, it's very unusual for me. It's probably unique for me. I didn't have a story to tell about that guy. It was just that he existed in my mind. And the story developed around the character.
This is another episode of our Innovation and Leadership series where we interview pro athletes, world-class musicians, CEOs, Hollywood filmmakers, and a wide variety of other high achievers. Before we get rolling, I want to invite you to get involved with Child Rescue, the charity our founders started. To learn more about them, just come to our website, icollective.co, and check on the Child Rescue tab on our menu. Also, I want to talk to you about one of our show's sponsors. I met these guys back on episode 6. CEO Zach Smith was telling me all about starting a skateboard company and how much he hated doing the bookkeeping for a skateboard shop, and how he really got led to start this business, Bookly, that's a hybrid combining bookkeeping software and human services. And I'll tell you why I let him become a sponsor. It's because I use their service now. I don't love paying $50 an hour for bookkeepers to do stuff that I know software could do way, way cheaper. But I don't love bookkeeping at all. So I want a real live human who knows what they're talking about to help me with the stuff I don't understand. Probably the straw that broke the camel's back for me, though, the thing that put me over the top was that they could do my taxes and payroll also. So totally suggest checking them out. Go to their website, bookly.co, and check out their flat rates. I've been super happy with them. So now on to today's episode. Kyle, thanks for making time.
Thanks for having me.
So for anyone who isn't aware of the Mitch Rapp series and the Michael Keaton movie that came out last week, and your writing career in general, can you tell us just a bit about your career path and how you got to here?
Yeah, I started about 20 years ago. Probably got into this business a little differently than most people. I think most people have a passion for writing from when they're young and pursue it and dream of having a career in it. I was a corporate banker and a rock climber. That was kind of my obsession at the time. But I never really did anything creative. So I started thinking about that. I'd always admired creative people and decided I was going to build furniture. But the truth is, I'm not very handy, which is something my wife mentioned to me. And she's the one that suggested I write a novel. So it seemed like kind of a dumb idea. I'd studied economics and had never really done much creative. I hadn't really done any creative writing. But it kind of stuck in my head because I'd been a huge reader my entire life since I was very, very young. I'd read thrillers in particular. I couldn't get it out of my head, so I kind of embarked on it. And in the methodical way that I normally do, I bought a bunch of books on how to write a novel and read them all and wrote a book.
And was that Phoenix Rising? What was the first one?
Yeah, Rising Phoenix.
Rising Phoenix.
Yeah, and so I honestly never really thought that it would probably get published. I was pretty realistic about that, but people that read it really liked it, and I thought, why not give it a try? Which is sort of soul crushing to if anybody out there's ever done it. You basically get turned down by everybody, and I did, but I finally did get an agent, and that went on to be a national bestseller. Yeah. And I ended up signing a 2-book deal, which was a little weird because it had never occurred to me that I'd ever write a second book. It had just been kind of an exercise in creativity.
That's so interesting. So I'd love to talk about this because I feel like we have a society that likes to tell you can only be one thing and you can only do one thing. And if I remember right, you said that you didn't do particularly well at English historically in school or something. And here you go from, a finance major, you're giving loans at the bank, to now not just a best-selling author, but a New York Times #1 best-selling author. Can you talk about any thoughts that you have about maybe not letting limitations get in the way, or it's going to be hard, but maybe it's worth it?
Yeah, it's kind of a strange world with that. I grew up, my father was an FBI agent, grew up in Oregon, grew up in DC, and the people around me were, this is becoming very handy. We're all FBI, CIA, Spec Ops people, MI6, and they're a very certain type of person. You probably noticed if you read thriller novels. And I don't know that I necessarily fit in with that group, but I found them really fascinating. fascinating. I moved from Baltimore to Jackson Hole, Wyoming, which because I was such a serious rock climber, and got a job here. I had been a corporate banker there. I got a job here at a bank, and this was the place that inspired it, and the people, because they were all very, very different than anybody I had ever met before. You know, they didn't talk about what they did for work. There seemed to be a kind of an infinite sense of possibility with them. And I mean, even when I got here, I started climbing with a guy, and a few weeks into knowing him, he called me up one day and said, "Hey, why don't we fly to Thailand next week, and we'll spend a few months climbing there?" And I said, "Well, I can't just go off to Thailand." And he said, "Why not? I've got a house there, and it'll be free." And I said, well, I have a job. And he said, "Well, quit it. You can always get another one." And I thought, I could just quit it. I could get another one. And that's the way people thought. They'd just come back from, summiting Everest, or, spending, 6 months, riding their bike across Africa or something. And it had never occurred to me that you could just do stuff like that. I think about people I meet that, they say, "I've always wanted to go to France, and, I've been planning to do this for my whole life and everything." And now, having lived in Jackson and been around people like this for so many years, I think, why don't you just buy a ticket, get on a plane, go for the weekend? I mean, just do it. And it took me a long time, though, to make that transition. I remember another friend of mine called, and he was also in Thailand, and he was working on a Leonardo DiCaprio movie. He's a professional climber I climbed with. And he said, "Hey, you should fly out to Thailand." And I convinced them that I need an assistant, and they'll pay you $500 a day. And we don't really do anything because Leo never gets anywhere near a cliff. And once again, I said, "Well, I can't just leave." And he said, "Why not? You get $500 a day and they feed us. You don't have to do anything. We'll just go climbing." And I didn't do it. And I always regret that. I think, why didn't I just do it?
Yeah.
But, it wasn't programmed into me that you just do stuff. You can do anything you want as long as you allow it.
Well, because I want to talk about this. I really see that in the action sports world in general. We had a guy on the show who's invented kind of a new form of snowboarding. Has no bindings. They call it pow surfing. And we've had different, entrepreneurs who used to be skateboarders, or just folks from the action sports world where they failed a whole bunch of times, and that's just part of the process, and they just go for it anyways. And I mean, I heard a story that you had rejection letters. You had so many rejection letters that your wall of shame fell off and hit your computer. Is that true?
Yeah, that is an actual true story. I put a bulletin board up there and kept putting them on there. It got too heavy and pulled out of the wall.
But that kind of rejection, and to keep trying, seems like a pretty common thing amongst people who actually make it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's something really to that. I can't remember. I think it was Brad Thor, another one of my colleagues, who said something to the effect of if all you do is keep trying, you've narrowed your options down to only one: success. And I think that's absolutely true. Now, I mean, there are certainly external factors, and I think it's very important for you to be realistic about your abilities and your innate abilities. To be honest with you, all I ever wanted to be was a musician, but I'm terrible. So no matter how hard I pursued it, that was never going to happen. But I mean, if you're realistic, and that's the other thing is, you've got to seek out in life, what are you good at? What do you enjoy? For me, my course, at least I thought when I was young, was set. It was the 80s. You went to business school, you became, a banker or an investment person, and, you made a lot of money, and that's what you did with your life.
Yeah.
And then I discovered not everybody does that with their lives, and there are some other lives that are pretty good too.
Yeah. Well, when you think about it does seem like you didn't just go willy-nilly either. Like, it wasn't just on hopes and dreams. Like, you knew you were starting the beginning, and you went and got a whole bunch of the books, and you actually read them and looked. It sounds to me like you were looking for the patterns that worked for other people. Is that accurate?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think writing is maybe the worst thing, with people kind of using the fact that it's a subjective and creative endeavor to cover up the fact that they aren't willing to work hard at it. It's not easy, and I think people think because they can talk or they can write a letter that you can write a piece of novel-length fiction, and it's a lot of work. I mean, you can have all the talent in the world, but if you're not willing to criticize yourself and and learn from other people and admit, that something isn't good or that maybe you're not good at something, it's going to be very hard, I think, to succeed.
I'd love to hear what you think some of those patterns are. In my emails back and forth with your wife, trying to figure out how to get you on the show, I was telling her, I've read probably 200 plus books from this genre, and this is hands down my favorite series, and I think I, like thousands and thousands of the other fans, were so impressed with how seamless it is. I think if people didn't read the front of the books, they wouldn't know where Vince left and you picked up, and that's not an average skill. Like it's obvious you have honed your craft and you've put in the hours. What do you feel like are some of the common mistakes for, and let's talk specifically the thriller genre. Let's say I want to write books someday in the thriller, which I actually would. What do you feel like are some of the most common mistakes?
I think probably the most common mistake would be making it too detailed and too plot oriented, potentially even sometimes too realistic. The truth is that books are about people, and that's what attracts them, attracts a reader. So you'll read some novels that are, particularly war novels, that are, have 1,000 characters in them. None of them are really well developed, 800 acronyms, and it just gets piled on. And while it might be realistic, it's not particularly readable. So that, and look, those kinds of war books are particularly hard. I mean, if you read Tom Clancy's Red Storm Rising, there's an example of somebody who, did it right. They managed to write a very long and technical book that still had characters and scenarios that you cared about.
Well, obviously you've done it well where, Enemy of the State, I think you said it's number 2 on New York Times right now. I just looked on Amazon. It's in the top 5 best-selling books on all of Amazon currently in the whole world. Ahead of Jean Le Carré, by the way.
Oh, nice.
Right? With nice
notch
on the belt
so,
there.
Considering he's, certainly one of the people that got me into this business. So,
right.
And a legend. It's always nice to meet him.
Yeah. When you think about this human, like, I think, obviously big fan of Enemy of the State. I listened to it within 24 hours of it coming out on Audible. And I am kind of a Mitch Rapp junkie, but so my friends weren't surprised about that. But, I think about some of your other great books. Like I think my favorite of your other books is probably Fade. And as soon as you said that about the human thing, it really made me think, here's a, somewhat flawed character that I drastically identified with. Like I cared so much about him. And at, the end of that book where things are getting pretty dicey, I was really involved with him as an individual. I identified with him as an individual. Is that something, as a writer, how do we get that dialed in to the characters as a person?
That was kind of the genesis of that book was a little bit unusual. That I had a friend who was in Spec Ops in Vietnam. He was my father's best friend, and he and I had gone shooting once when I was probably 16 or something, and he had a Russian gun, and he only had 4 rounds for it, but he let me shoot one of them. And I asked him where he would come by something like that, and he said, well, I was walking through the jungle one day, and there was a Russian guy there putting on his boots, so I shot him in the head. And then I went up and I did all this other stuff, and he had a big story about, the Viet Cong were going to attack, and he was doing a recon. And he said I was walking back through the jungle, and this gun was lying next to him. It was his gun, so I took it as a souvenir. And it was a very nonchalant conversation, and it always stuck with me that he had killed this guy and hadn't really thought much about it. But he was also a very funny and colorful and very flawed sort of character. I mean, the kind of guy that at a dinner party would pass out and his face would just hit the table. And so Fade started with that idea of this guy that was colorful and funny, but also very nonchalant about killing people. And so when I started that book, it's very unusual for me. It's probably unique for me. I didn't have a story to tell about that guy. It was just that he existed in my mind, and the story developed around the character. And to me, writing a character is a little bit like applied schizophrenia. It's you have to sort of become that character whose point of view you're writing from, and then you just channel that person. And sometimes they surprise you. They do things that you wouldn't expect them to do. I mean, I had a Mitch Rapp book where he slept with this woman, and that wasn't in my outline. I'd never even thought about it, but there I was typing away, and he did it. And I was thinking, no, don't do that. This is going to end horribly for you, which it did. So that I think is the important thing, and probably just like acting, the more different that character is from you, the harder it becomes to inhabit the character. And so sometimes, I wrote a serial killer book once, and it was very hard for me to inhabit that character.
Yeah. I re-listened to Order to Kill last week because I knew we were going to be on the show together, and I was thinking about that because I had seen your interview where you talked about, we'll see where Mitch goes with this. And I wanted to see if you had any guidance, because it sounds like as it was unfolding, here's what you realized the character needs to do, even though you hadn't planned it that way.
Mm-hmm.
If I understand you right, how do you know, how do you stay on the balance beam and not overdo it and not underdo it with the planning versus recognizing what Mitch is going to do?
My process is probably different than almost anyone's, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. But I write very, very elaborate outlines. So my outlines are for 110,000. So this book, I'm looking at it right now here on my computer. This book will probably end up being about 110,000 pages. My outline's 110,000 words. My outline is 40,000 words. So it's really nailed down. I've thought about this and written about this for a long time before I ever write a chapter. But then I don't necessarily follow the outline entirely. So I understand the story, I understand the characters, but then I'm pretty open to them going in other directions. But by the time I sort of put pen to paper to write the prose, I really understand the story and the characters. And that I think allows me the freedom to let them go their own way.
Yeah. I'm interested too in the ways that you rely on your background. The couple of phone calls I made here, I was telling you before we started recording, I called one of our consultants who's from one of the tier 1 units, the Army Special Missions Unit, former guy, who, by the way, said he's heard good things about the movie. And then the second one was our consultant who at Mylan Advisors, who's 22-year counterintelligence agent, FBI hostage negotiator also, and asking him about the cool stuff Legats used to do and get to do. And can you talk just a little bit about your dad's generation, the gun toters, and how you feel like that's been a benefit to be able to draw on that?
Yeah, I mean, the FBI now, probably for better, is a pretty intellectual organization. But it was different in the 70s. It was, more of, I guess, more of, I don't know, it was a little Wild West. I mean, particularly my father, we lived in Oregon, and he handled Western Oregon, which is pretty out there. And he's been, thrown out of second-story windows and attacked by monkeys, and been in gunfights where he forgot his gun. And I mean, the stories just sort of abounded. And a lot of them were funny because that's the truth of those kinds of situations. There's a lot of gallows humor, and mistakes are made, and if you survive them, they turn out, the stories turn out being pretty funny about it. And so that I think it speaks very much to this type of character, like the Mitch Rapp type of character, because it is a very action-oriented character as opposed to, more of a Sherlock Holmes or very intellectual, investigative kind of book. I mean, Mitch decides what he's going to do, and then he acts on that. So I think that history was important for me, to see those people, my father and his friends, who really literally did chase down criminals.
Yeah. It seems like it would give you such a flavor as you consider situations to be able to think about, the folks that hung out with your dad, the folks you got to go shooting with, and be able to think, what would this guy have done in that situation? Am I putting too many words in your mouth there, or is that?
No, that's absolutely true. I mean, all these characters that I create are tend to be composites of people I've known in the past. I think it'd be very hard, if you think the way Vince did it, he did it, in my mind, backward. He did it the hard way. I got into writing and to some extent decided to write thrillers. I was a fan of a lot of different genres because I thought, well, it'll be easy. I mean, this is before the internet. I have all these contacts in the intelligence and law enforcement community, and I can write a credible book about this. I think poor Vince, he wrote the book and then got the contacts. So those first couple of books must have been really difficult.
Yeah. Well, and do I remember right? Like over in London, your dad would work with the like head of MI6 or stuff like this, or like, didn't you have all sorts of cool people coming through when you guys were over there?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I didn't at the time. I didn't necessarily even know who they all were. I knew there was a guy that nice guy, and they called him C, but I assumed that was because his name was Chris. And it turns out C is actually, in the James Bond movies, is M. And I didn't really realize that until we were driving somewhere and there was a traffic jam. So we just jumped over the median on the highway, and they closed the other side of the highway, and we just drove up it with a motorcade. And I thought, there's something to this guy.
Yeah, it's an advantage when you spent time with the real life M, right? um, So, I want to ask a little bit about, creativity and inventing these worlds and inhabiting these characters. I hear stories about how much J.R.R. Tolkien did in the background of the world of Middle Earth. And, in a small way, I look at your Twitter and I see, this is how I pictured Joe Maslick's grandparents, maybe. And it's, this beefy, big beefy guy in a huge fur coat and, like, I don't know, lumberjack looking dude. How much do you think about where they came from and their backstory, and what's your methodology there?
A lot. Most of it doesn't ever get to the page. I think I talked about Joe Maslick's background in a book where how he had grown up poor and in the South, and what it had been like and why he'd gotten into the military and all this, because that's always been in my head in order to create that character who I can sort of become when I'm writing from their point of view. So I know where these guys went to high school and what their girlfriend was like back then. And I'd probably never write that down because probably most people wouldn't be interested. But for me, it generates this rich and very real character that then I don't have to sit down and think, oh, what would this person do, or what would this person say at any given time? They just do it and say it, and I write it down. I mean, to some extent, when I write books, I'm kind of a spectator, and I'm just writing down what's happening and what people are doing, and it all, I have this outline, but then it just goes all in different directions as I'm sort of living it. Whereas the outline is more of a intellectual process, what needs to happen where, and that kind of thing.
It makes me think more back to this comment that you said that novels are really about people. There's a quote from that old Dale Carnegie How to Win Friends and Influence People book about the editor who could tell within 10 pages if the author liked people. And that would be the biggest predictor of book sales or not, according to this editor. And it makes me think, like, I thought it was so fun. I don't want to, spoil the book, so I won't share too much. But for me, it felt like, hey, they're getting the band back together with some of these folks, right?
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about, so we can talk about Order to Kill. The backstory of Grisha, for instance, to me, that really did help me want to identify identify with that character, which, if I do have a criticism of some other authors in the genre, there's a real emphasis on tough guys. There's a real emphasis on overcoming situations, but there isn't always that deeper identification with the character development.
Yeah, Grisha. So Grisha is a character that I created, and so he did not exist in the what I call the rap verse prior to me. And the idea has always been, I think, with the Vince Flynn books and the Mitch Rapp books, is to put Mitch up against, into situations that maybe Vince hadn't, to just see what he'll do. It's kind of the fun of it for me. So Grisha I created as being sort of almost an equal to Mitch, and he'd never really faced anybody that he had to worry about maybe not being able to beat. But Grisha is a very different type of a person. He's kind of trapped in his world and in his life, didn't necessarily want to be, but he was good at it. And so I think much more if anything, if I've done anything in those books that's me, my tendency is to try to cleave very close to Vince's style, but it would be Grisha. He's very much a character that seems like maybe could be out of one of my books. He's a little introspective, a little gloomy, and like you say, has kind of a rich and deep background to him that gives you a pretty clear picture of why he is the way he is.
Yeah. Well, I think we're coming up on the end of part one here. For anybody listening that says they want to be a New York Times #1 bestseller, what's some of the best advice you would give?
Don't go into it with that goal.
Okay.
There's so many factors to having huge commercial success in writing that have not necessarily anything to do with how good your book is. But if you do want to be successful in this business, I think one thing you have to remember at this point is that it's not about going and sitting in your basement and writing a book. You do have to produce a good book, but now there's a significant amount of marketing demands, and you have to be smart about that.
Like the business around it?
Yeah, that has become that's gone much more to the author than it was when I started in this business. When I started in this business, what could you do? You counted on your publisher to market the books, advertise it, make sure they were in the stores, make sure they had a great cover, get you interviews or whatever. But now with the internet, the author has the power and thus the obligation to go out there and to market themselves and their books. I mean, you can't completely rely on your publisher anymore.
Yeah. And is your point about not having that be the goal kind of the counterintuitive of like focus on the writing and don't worry about the success, like focus on honing your craft, focus on that? Or
yeah, well, you can't do much without a good book. So that should be your initial goal, is to make sure you've written a really strong book. And that, again, I can't stress this enough. That's hard work. It's hard work for anybody, no matter how talented they are. And you really have to get in there and criticize your own work. And you have to look at other people's work, see what's popular, figure out why it's popular. I did this when I first started. I read 3 books that were different from one another in the thriller genre, but that were all really popular. And I kind of studied them and said, well, what works in these books and what really didn't work in these books? And how would I incorporate that into my own career and my own writing style? And I think that examination of those books allowed me to criticize my own books more. And later, it allowed me to do the exact same thing to Vince's books. I read through the entire series in order again. I'd read a bunch of them previously just as a fan, and studied them and figured out, what works in these books, what doesn't work in it, how does he do things, and in an effort to, essentially with the survivor, write a forgery.
I love it. Well, let's end there for part 1. Everybody, please tune in for the next episode. We're going to keep asking Vince the questions of how he did it and what the rest of us can learn from it. Thanks so much. We're going to cut off part 1 of the interview there in the interest of time. We've had feedback that people would rather have 20 to 30 minute episodes, so we're going to break the interviews in half. Please check back tomorrow for part 2 of the interview. And as always, come to icollective.co for show notes. And to learn more about child rescue, go to the menu and look at our child rescue page and see if that's something that you'd like to get involved with. Thanks for listening.